The morning after my husband's funeral, I woke to the soft click of my hallway floorboards and a whisper that didn't belong to the house's grief. I lay still, staring into the pale winter light, and realized my children were already dividing me up, room by room, while I was still breathing. I was 67, and the quiet had become my closest companion. The kind of quiet that settles into a home when the second toothbrush disappears from the cup and no one says, "I'm back," as the door shuts. Frank had been gone less than 24 hours, and the scent of lilies from the funeral still clung to my coat like a pleading hand. I hadn't even put it away. It was draped over the back of a dining chair, the same chair Frank used to pull out for me every Sunday morning when he made pancakes too thin and smiled like he'd invented breakfast. That morning, my joints ached from sleeping upright in the recliner. The bed felt too wide, too honest. I dozed off sometime near dawn with a half-empty glass of water on the side table and a folded funeral program resting on my chest. Frank's name was printed in crisp black ink above a photo that made my stomach tighten. Him in his favorite navy sweater, squinting into sunlight, one hand lifted as if he'd just waved at someone he loved. My phone sat face down, silent for once. The night before, it had buzzed until my hand went numb from answering. Neighbors, church friends, Frank's old coworkers, everyone saying the same careful things. He was a good man. He's at peace. Let me know if you need anything. They meant well, but after the last casserole dish was dropped off and the last hug loosened, the house felt like a theater after the show, empty seats, dust in the light, and the echo of applause that didn't matter anymore. I heard the whisper again, not the wind, not the heater. "It should go to us anyway. Mom won't manage it." A man's voice, low and familiar. My son, Brian, then my daughter Linda, sharper, as if she were slicing thread with her teeth. "I'm not saying take everything. I'm saying we need to be practical. She's emotional right now." Emotional. That was their word for grief, a label they could stick on my forehead like a warning sign. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe right. I let the silence cover me like a blanket while I listened from the recliner in the living room, my body heavy and my mind suddenly bright, the way it gets when something inside you snaps into clarity. Their voices drifted from the kitchen. The kitchen was only 10 steps away, but in that moment, it felt like another country. "He always said the house would stay in the family," Brian murmured. "And the lake cabin, too." "The cabin is in their name, I think," Linda said. "Or it was. I don't know. We need to find the paperwork. Mom probably doesn't even know where it is." I almost laughed, and the sound caught in my throat like a sob. I knew exactly where the paperwork was. I had been the one to file it, label it, and tuck it away the way you tuck away important things when you've spent your life expecting to be the one left behind. Frank and I had built our life on ordinary details. Mortgage statements, property tax bills, insurance renewals, the rhythm of checking and savings accounts, receipts folded into neat squares. We weren't rich, but we were careful. Frank worked 37 years at the same manufacturing plant outside Columbus, the kind of place with time clocks and safety goggles and a break room that smelled like burnt coffee. I worked part-time at the public library until my knees started making decisions my pride didn't approve of. We raised 2 children in this house. We repainted its walls with our own hands, argued about curtains, patched the porch steps, and wrote checks we prayed wouldn't bounce. We celebrated birthdays in the same dining room where my coat now held the scent of a funeral. I had thought the hardest part would be learning how to say "my husband" in the past tense. I hadn't expected to become a topic of negotiation. Brian's voice lowered again, like he was sharing a secret with someone he trusted. "We can't let her start giving money away. You know how she gets. She'll want to donate to the church or help one of those neighbors or— Oh, my God, Linda said, exasperated. Brian, stop. She's not a child. She's not thinking clearly. We need to step in. Step in. Like I was a pothole on their road. A memory flickered, unwanted and bright. Linda at 16, crying at the kitchen table because she'd missed curfew, and Frank had been strict about rules. I'd slipped her a cup of cocoa and told her, "Your father loves you so much it makes him clumsy." Brian at 12, begging for a new baseball glove, and Frank pretending to sigh dramatically before pulling the money from his wallet with a grin. I had been there for every scraped knee, every report card, every late-night fever. I had been their soft place. Now they spoke as if I were a problem to be handled. I turned my face toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet, the sky the color of dishwater. A thin crust of snow lay on the lawn, untouched. Frank's truck was still in the driveway, washed and waxed the way he liked it, though he would never turn the key again. My stomach tightened until it felt like a fist. I kept listening. "There's also the bank account," Brian said. "Dad had savings. He told me once he wanted me to have it if something happened." Linda made a small sound of disbelief. "You? He told you that?" "He said it when we were fishing. He said I'm the one who understands money." I almost sat up then. The audacity of that sentence. Brian had bounced checks in his 20s and called me for help when his car got repossessed. I'd quietly paid the towing fee so he wouldn't lose his job. I'd never told Frank because I didn't want my husband to carry another worry. "Mom's name is on everything," Linda said. "But that doesn't mean she should control it all." The word control hung in the air, thick and ugly. I wondered how long they'd been thinking this way. Was it only grief making them greedy? Or had it been there all along, tucked behind smiles and holiday visits, waiting for the moment my protector was gone? Frank had been the center pole of our little tent. Without him, they must have seen open space. I finally shifted in the recliner, careful not to creak it. My back complained. My eyes burned. I pressed 2 fingers against the inside of my wrist and felt my pulse, steady and stubborn. I remembered something Frank used to say when the world felt unfair. "Ruthie," he'd tell me, using the nickname that made me feel young again, "you don't win by yelling. You win by staying calm and doing it right." He wasn't a man of speeches. His wisdom came in small, practical sentences. And in that moment, beneath the ache of loss, something else rose. A quiet, steady resolve that surprised even me. Not rage. Not revenge the way movies show it, with slammed doors and broken glass. Something older and cleaner. Boundaries. Truth. Paperwork. I waited until I heard a drawer open in the kitchen. Then the rustle of folders. "They're in here somewhere," Linda said. My breath caught. The filing cabinet. The beige metal cabinet Frank and I kept near the pantry. The one I'd organized after he was diagnosed with heart failure. I'd done it the way you pack a suitcase when you know you'll need it in an emergency. Carefully, methodically, with love and fear folded together. If they were digging through that cabinet now, they were already crossing a line they hadn't earned the right to cross. I closed my eyes and pictured the top drawer. The labels, utilities, insurance, property, medical, legal. Frank and I had updated our wills 2 years ago, right after he came home from the hospital and sat at this very table, pale and quieter than I'd ever seen him. He'd taken my hand and said, "Promise me you'll be protected." And I had promised. Not just with words, with signatures, with notarized pages, with a folder that lived in a safe deposit box at Huntington Bank, the key taped under the false bottom of my sewing kit. No one knew that but Frank and me. In the kitchen, Brian's voice sharpened. "Here, this says property." Linda exhaled like she'd found gold. Open it." There was a pause, a soft tearing sound. They were opening my folder. My grief flared hot, not because of money, but because of the disrespect. Because even in my mourning, even in my exhaustion, they were taking space, taking authority, taking for granted that I would never push back. I opened my eyes. The room looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Same family photos on the mantel, same crocheted throw on the couch. But I felt like I'd stepped into a different version of my life. The version where I stopped being gentle by default. I stood slowly. My knees protested, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me I was here. I smoothed the funeral program, set it on the table, and picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. I didn't call them out right away. Not yet. I took one step toward the kitchen, then another, and I listened to their words as if I were gathering evidence. "We'll have to get her to sign something," Brian said. "A transfer or a power of attorney." Linda's voice softened, and somehow that was worse. "We can talk to her gently. She trusts us." That sentence landed like a slap. She trusts us. Yes, I had, because mothers do, until they learn they shouldn't. I stepped into the doorway. They both froze. Linda was standing at the counter with a manila folder open in front of her. Brian had his hand on a stack of papers, like he was about to shuffle them away. Their faces were flushed, eyes wide, guilty in that quick, animal way people look when they're caught doing something they know is wrong. For a moment, none of us spoke. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and funeral flowers. The clock above the stove ticked too loudly. I let my gaze move from the folder to their faces. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble the way they might have expected. I just stood there in my house, still wearing yesterday's grief like a second skin. Linda swallowed. "Mom, you're up." Brian tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "We were just trying to help." Help. Another useful word. A word that could mean anything. I looked at the papers on my counter. Papers I had filed, safeguarded, and paid for with years of careful living. Then I looked back at them. "I heard you," I said, my voice quiet but clear. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. They stared at me as if I had spoken in another language. Brian's hand slowly left the papers, like a child caught reaching into a cookie jar. Linda closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, too calm for someone who had just been exposed. "Heard us... what?" she asked, her voice careful. "Everything," I said. I walked to the kitchen table and sat down, the same chair Frank used to pull out for me. My legs felt steady. That surprised me. "From the part where I won't manage to the part where you decide what I should control." Brian cleared his throat. "Mom, you're upset. This isn't the time." I almost smiled at that. The timing, apparently, was never right for me to speak. When Frank was alive, it was always easier to let him handle things. I had allowed that, willingly. Love makes you soft in ways you don't notice until you need your spine. "I'm not upset," I said. "I'm paying attention." Linda reached for my hand, then thought better of it. "We're worried about you, that's all. You've been through a shock." Shock. As if grief erased intelligence. As if 40 years of paying bills, signing contracts, and keeping a household running vanished with a funeral. I stood again and took the folder from the counter. "My folder. This stays closed unless I open it," I said. Still calm, still quiet. Brian frowned. "Dad would want us involved." "Your father wanted me protected," I replied. He was very clear about that. They exchanged a glance, quick and loaded. I recognized it. The same look they used to share as teenagers, when they thought I didn't notice. I walked past them, and returned the folder to the cabinet, sliding the drawer shut with a click that sounded louder than it should have. My hands didn't shake. Inside, though, something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. That afternoon, after they left with stiff hugs and promises to check in, I sat alone at the dining table. Sunlight moved slowly across the wood grain. I opened my checkbook, balanced it the way I always had, then gathered my documents one by one. Deeds, statements, insurance policies. I made a list in my head, not of steps, but of truths. I was alone now, but I was not helpless. That night, I slept in my bed for the first time since Frank died. It was still too wide, still too quiet. But as I lay there listening to the house settle, I understood something clearly for the first time. Grief had made them bold, and it had made me awake. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked between my front door and the welcome mat. Plain white. No stamp, just my name written in Linda's careful handwriting, the kind she used on thank you cards and job applications. My stomach tightened before I even bent down to pick it up. Inside was a printed document titled Durable Power of Attorney. 3 pages, highlighted sections. A sticky note on top that read, "We can go over this together. It's just in case." Just in case, as if yesterday hadn't already happened. I carried the envelope into the kitchen and set it beside my coffee mug. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the room with a sound that felt too cheerful for the moment. Frank used to say mornings told the truth about people. You could fake a lot of things later in the day, but not who you were before breakfast. I read every word slowly. The legal language wasn't unfamiliar. Frank and I had reviewed documents like this together, pencil in hand, asking questions, refusing anything that felt rushed or vague. This one gave broad authority. Banking, property, medical decisions. It didn't say Linda and Brian would help me. It said they would act for me. I folded the pages back into the envelope and stared out the window. Across the street, Mrs. Callahan was struggling with her trash bin, the lid flapping in the wind. I'd helped her just last week. She'd thanked me and said, "You're lucky to have children who check on you." I wondered what luck meant now. By mid-morning, my phone rang. Linda's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," she said brightly, too brightly. "Did you get the papers?" "Yes," I said. A pause. And I won't be signing them." The silence stretched. I could almost hear her recalibrating. "We just want to make things easier," she said. "For everyone. You don't need stress right now." I looked at the calendar on the wall, still turned to last month. Frank had circled our anniversary in blue ink. "What makes you think I don't know how to manage my own life?" I asked. Another pause. Shorter this time. "That's not what I said." "It's what you meant." Her voice cooled. "Brian and I talked to a lawyer friend. This is very normal." "Normal doesn't mean necessary," I replied. "Or right," she sighed. "You're being stubborn." There it was, the old word, the one used when a woman doesn't quietly agree. After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, my hands wrapped around cold coffee. I thought about all the times I'd stepped back to keep the peace, all the times I'd told myself it wasn't worth the argument. Have you ever realized too late that being agreeable taught people you wouldn't resist? That afternoon, I drove to the bank. Huntington Bank had changed its carpets since Frank and I first opened our accounts there, but the smell was the same: paper, polish, and patience. I asked for Ms. Reynolds, the branch manager who had helped us set up our safe deposit box years ago. She recognized me immediately, her expression softening. "I'm sorry about your husband," she said, leading me into her office. "Thank you," I replied. "I need to review some things." We went through my accounts together, checking savings, the investment account Frank had started late once the mortgage was nearly paid off. Everything was exactly where it should be. My name on every line that mattered. No surprises, no missing funds. I asked about adding alerts, extra verification, small protections most people don't think about until they need them. Ms. Reynolds nodded and made notes, explaining each change without rushing me. "You're being very thorough," she said kindly. "I've learned that thorough is safer than trusting," I answered. From there, I drove to the attorney's office Frank and I had used for our wills. The receptionist handed me a tissue before I even asked for one. Apparently, I looked like someone who might need it. Our lawyer, Mr. Halverson, reviewed the documents with me. He reminded me of decisions I'd made while Frank was still alive, choices I had agreed to with clarity and intention. "You're fully in control," he said gently. "No one can override that without your consent or a court order, and there's no basis for that." Relief washed over me, followed quickly by something sharper. Anger, yes, but also sadness. Because none of this would have been necessary if my children had trusted me the way I had trusted them. When I got home, Brian's car was in the driveway. He stood in the living room, hands in his pockets, eyes darting to the bookshelf, the framed photos, the quiet corners of the house. "Linda told me you refused," he said. "I did." He shook his head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," I said, setting my purse down. "I'm making it clear." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't do all this alone." I met his gaze. "I already have." Something flickered across his face then. Not concern, not love, uncertainty, the realization that the version of me he'd been counting on, the tired, pliable one, was no longer available. He left without another word. That evening, I sat at my desk and organized my papers into neat stacks. Not because I was afraid of losing control, but because I wanted proof of it. I labeled folders, made copies, placed originals where only I could access them. The act was grounding, almost peaceful. Frank used to tease me for my filing system. He said it was excessive. Now, it felt like armor. As I turned off the lamp and prepared for bed, one question lingered, heavy but honest. Have you ever felt the moment when patience stops being a virtue and starts being a warning? I slept deeply that night, not because the pain was gone, but because for the first time since the funeral, I trusted myself completely. The morning after that night, I woke with a headache that felt earned, the kind that comes not from illness, but from too many thoughts circling the same truth. I sat at the edge of the bed and listened to the house. No footsteps, no whispers, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a garbage truck moving down the street. I made myself toast and ate it standing at the counter. Crumbs scattered across the surface, and for once I didn't brush them away right away. Frank used to joke that I cleaned like someone expecting company even when there was none. I realized then how much of my life had been spent preparing for others. Around 10, my phone vibrated. A text from Brian. "We should talk. In person." I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I set the phone down and opened my laptop. Not to answer him, but to look up something I hadn't thought I'd need so soon. I logged into our home security account. Frank had insisted on cameras after a string of break-ins a few blocks over. I'd teased him about it. Now, I thanked him silently. The login worked on the first try. I clicked through the timeline, my finger steady on the mouse. Late night, early morning. There it was, a familiar figure at my back door, moving carefully, glancing over his shoulder before using a key. Brian. Entering my house at 1:42 a.m., I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The hurt came first, sharp and deep. Then, something steadier followed. Clarity has a way of arriving late, but when it does, it stays. I saved the clip, then another from inside the kitchen. The drawer, the cabinet, him opening folders that didn't belong to him. His face wasn't cruel, just focused, as if he believed he had every right. By noon, I was at the police station. The building smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. I sat across from a young officer with kind eyes and explained slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I slid my ID across the desk, then my phone, already open to the video. He watched carefully, rewinding once. Did he have permission to be there? No, I said. He used an old key I forgot to retrieve. That doesn't count as permission, he said gently. A report was filed, not dramatic, not loud, just official. When I left, my hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of choosing myself over the idea of family harmony. That afternoon, Linda called. Why is Brian so upset? She demanded. He says you're accusing him of things. I'm documenting facts, I replied. There's a difference. You went to the police? Her voice cracked. He's your son, and this is my home. Silence again, then quieter. You didn't have to go that far. I looked at Frank's photo on the mantel as I spoke. I went exactly as far as I needed to. After the call, I changed the locks. I watched the locksmith work, his hands quick and practiced. Each click felt like a sentence ending properly. That evening, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and a cup of tea growing cold beside me. The sky darkened slowly, the way it always had. Nothing about the world had changed, only my place in it. I realized then that this wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. Inside, my phone buzzed once more. A message from Brian, short and stunned. I didn't think you'd actually do something. I didn't reply. I went inside, locked the door, and turned off the lights one by one. For the first time in days, the house felt like it belonged to me again. 2 days after I changed the locks, a certified letter arrived with a green return receipt card attached. I recognized Linda's address before I even opened it. My hands didn't shake this time. That surprised me, until I realized fear had been replaced by something stronger, knowing. Inside was a neatly typed notice on legal letterhead. It claimed Brian had been promised reimbursement for improvements he'd made to my home over the years, and that he expected repayment from my estate assets. There were line items, a bathroom upgrade, roof patch, landscaping, each with a number beside it that looked like it had been pulled from thin air. At the bottom was a polite threat about pursuing available remedies if we couldn't resolve this amicably. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change into something kinder if I stared hard enough. Frank and I had replaced that bathroom vanity ourselves, one Saturday in 2009, after the old one rotted at the base. Frank had cursed at the plumbing and then kissed my forehead when I handed him the wrench. Brian had been living 3 states away then. The roof patch? A local contractor named Pete Ramirez had done it after a hailstorm. I still had the invoice in a folder labeled Home Repairs, with Pete's signature and the date. Landscaping. Frank and I had planted those shrubs with our own hands, our knees muddy, laughing at how crooked the first one looked. It wasn't just greed. It was revision. They were rewriting my life as if I'd been sitting in a corner while they built it. I made another cup of coffee and opened my filing cabinet. The drawers slid out like they'd been waiting for me. Receipts, contracts, bank statements, canceled checks, the small paper trail of a marriage built on ordinary responsibility. I pulled out Pete's invoice, the canceled check stub, and the photos I'd taken of the roof damage for the insurance claim. I found the permit paperwork for a small porch repair from years ago. I even had an old email thread with the bathroom supply store because Frank had argued, politely of course, about a delivery delay. Then I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account. I downloaded PDF statements going back 5 years and highlighted every payment that matched home maintenance, contractors, hardware stores, property taxes, insurance premiums. When you want the truth to stand on its own, you let it be boring and complete. By the time the sun started to slip lower, I had a tidy stack of evidence and a calmness that felt almost unfamiliar. That calm cracked when I checked my voicemail, a message from a number I didn't recognize, a man's voice, formal and clipped. "Mrs. Carter, this is Daniel Larkins. I'm calling regarding an urgent matter with the property associated with your late husband. Please return my call as soon as possible." My throat tightened. I didn't like the word urgent. It was the kind of word people used when they wanted to steer you before you could think. I returned the call with my papers spread out on the table like a shield. The receptionist transferred me, and a moment later the same voice came on the line. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I represent your son. He's concerned you may have been taken advantage of in recent days." I almost laughed. It came out as a single breath. "Taken advantage of by whom?" I asked. There was a pause, and in it I could hear the soft rustle of someone shifting in a leather chair. "Well, he mentioned you've been making abrupt decisions, filing reports, changing locks. He believes you may not be in the right frame of mind and—" "Stop," I said quietly, not sharp, just final. "If you're going to speak about my mind, you can do it in writing. And if you have a claim, you can send it to my attorney." Another pause. "You have counsel?" "Yes," I answered, "and I keep records." The line went very still. "Mrs. Carter," he tried again, softer now, "your son's goal is to protect the family assets." "My husband's goal was to protect me," I said. "Those are not the same thing." When I hung up, I sat with my hand resting on the receiver of my own breath, like I was making sure I still belonged to myself. I could feel the old habits tugging. Be polite, be forgiving, keep the peace. But peace built on my silence wasn't peace. It was surrender. I drove to Mr. Halverson's office the next morning with the certified letter and my neat stack of receipts. He read through everything without interrupting, then looked at me over his glasses. "They're testing you," he said. "I know," I replied, "and I'm tired of being tested like I'm weak." He nodded once, approving without making a show of it. "You're doing the right thing by documenting. We'll respond. Factually. No emotion. Just proof." He drafted a letter on the spot. It was simple and devastating in the way truth can be. Brian's claims were unsupported, contradicted by invoices and bank records, and any further contact should go through counsel. He included a line about unauthorized entry, too, brief, neutral, but impossible to ignore. When he slid the letter across the desk for my review, I noticed my name typed above his signature line, followed by the word client. Client, not mother, not widow, not someone to manage, a person with rights. On my way out, I stopped at the post office and mailed it, certified, return receipt requested. The clerk stamped the green card, and the sound was oddly satisfying. A clean, official thud, a boundary made physical. That afternoon, I opened my front door to find Linda standing on my porch, cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright with something that looked like indignation dressed as concern. "You're turning this into a war," she said before I could even invite her in. I stayed in the doorway, not blocking her with aggression, just with presence. "I didn't start anything," I told her. "I'm finishing what you started when you decided I was yours to organize." Her expression faltered. "We're your children." "And I'm your mother," I said, "not your asset." She glanced past me into the house, as if searching for the old version of me to argue with. the one who would eventually soften, apologize, offer pie. Instead, she found me, standing steady, dressed in a plain cardigan, my grief still there but no longer steering the wheel. "I just don't understand why you're doing this," she whispered. I held her gaze. "Because I finally understand why you're doing what you're doing." Linda's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, she looked young again, not in innocence, but in uncertainty, like someone who expected the world to bend and had just met a limit. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "If you want to talk, you can call and set a time, and you can come as my daughter, not as my handler." Then I stepped back and closed the door gently. The new lock clicked into place with a sound that felt like my own heartbeat. Steady, lawful, unafraid. That night, I sat at my desk and made copies of everything once more. I slipped a set into a folder for my attorney and another into a sealed envelope for my safe deposit box. I wasn't preparing for battle. I was preparing for freedom. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches, and the house stayed quiet. Not the lonely quiet I'd feared, but the kind that comes when no one is taking from you anymore. The letter from my attorney changed the temperature of everything. It didn't stop the calls completely, but it altered their tone, like a room after someone authoritative has walked in. Voices softened. Words became careful. Silence appeared where entitlement used to be. A week passed, then another. I settled into a strange new rhythm. Mornings began with oatmeal and the local news murmuring in the background. Afternoons were for paperwork, small walks, and the quiet discipline of putting my life back in order. I donated Frank's clothes slowly, one sweater at a time, running my fingers over the fabric before folding it into the box. Grief became something I carried instead of something that carried me. Then came the email. It was from Linda. Not emotional, not angry, precise. She wanted a meeting, all of us, with a mediator. I read it twice, then once more after an hour had passed. My first instinct was no. My second was to let my attorney answer. But a third voice rose inside me, steady and older than fear. If I didn't show up now, they would always believe I was hiding behind process instead of standing in truth. I agreed, on one condition. My lawyer would be present. The mediation was held in a small office downtown, the kind with neutral art on the walls and chairs designed to discourage comfort. A long table divided the room neatly, as if it understood the assignment. Brian and Linda arrived together. They didn't sit close, but they didn't sit far apart either. Habits still bound them. Brian looked thinner, tired. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first. The mediator, a calm woman with silver hair pulled into a low bun, explained the rules in a voice that suggested she'd seen every version of family conflict there was. My attorney sat beside me, hands folded, unreadable. Linda had brought her lawyer too. Brian had not. That detail mattered. Linda spoke first. She talked about concern, about stress, about how everything had escalated. She avoided words like break-in and entitlement. She framed everything as confusion. When she finished, the mediator turned to me. "Mrs. Carter," she said gently, "would you like to respond?" I took a breath. Not to steady myself, I already was, but to honor the moment. "I buried my husband," I said. "Then I buried the version of my children I thought I had. That's what escalated things." Brian flinched. I continued slowly. "I did not accuse. I documented. I did not attack. I protected. Every step I took was legal, proportionate, and necessary." Linda opened her mouth, but the mediator raised a hand. "Let her finish," she said. I nodded in thanks and went on. I spoke about the power of attorney, about the night Brian entered my home without permission, About the letters, the claims, the revisions of history that tried to turn my life into a balance sheet. Then I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies, camera stills, receipts, statements, dates, no commentary, no flourish, just facts. The mediator reviewed them carefully. Linda's lawyer leaned forward, his expression tightening with each page. Brian stared at the table like it might swallow him whole. When the mediator looked up, her tone had changed, not harsh, but firm. "Mrs. Carter has acted entirely within her rights," she said. "There is no evidence of incapacity. There is evidence of overreach." Silence settled like dust. Brian finally looked at me. His eyes were red, not with anger, but with something closer to shame. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "It went exactly as far as you pushed it." Linda exhaled sharply. "So what now?" she asked. "Are you cutting us off?" The question hung heavy, loaded with fear disguised as indignation. "No," I said. "I'm setting terms." My attorney shifted slightly but said nothing. This was my moment. "I am willing to have a relationship with you," I continued, "but not one where I'm managed, monitored, or mined for assets. There will be no more documents placed in front of me just in case. No more discussions about my property without me present. No more assumptions that grief makes me less capable." I paused, then added, "And there will be no unsupervised access to my home. Ever." Linda's lips pressed together. Brian nodded once, stiffly. The mediator wrote something down. "Are these terms acceptable?" she asked. Linda glanced at her lawyer. He gave a small, reluctant nod. "Yes," Linda said. "They're acceptable." Brian swallowed. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't complete, but it was real. I felt the apology land, not like a healing balm, but like the first brick laid back in place. Whether the wall would ever stand again remained to be seen. The meeting ended without hugs. That was fine. Some truths don't need physical closeness. Outside, the sky was pale and wide. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in cold air that felt cleaner than it had in weeks. My attorney asked if I was all right. "I am," I said, and I meant it. That night, alone in my living room, I replayed the day in my mind. Not with regret, but with recognition. I had not lost my children. I had found myself. I poured a small glass of wine and sat in Frank's old chair. The house held me quietly. No whispers, no intrusions. Have you ever noticed how people react when you stop shrinking for their comfort? I turned off the lamp and let the darkness settle, not as something to fear, but as something honest. After the mediation, the house felt different. Not lighter exactly, but steadier, like a table that had finally stopped wobbling because someone had taken the time to fix one short leg. I noticed it in small ways. The way I slept through the night without jolting awake. The way my shoulders didn't stay lifted around my ears when the phone rang. Brian didn't call for a while. Linda sent a brief message thanking me for meeting halfway. I didn't respond right away. Halfway had been my entire life. Now I was learning how to stay where I stood. I returned to routines I'd abandoned when everything became urgent. On Tuesdays, I went back to the library as a volunteer. The building still smelled of dust and paper and quiet intention. I shelved books slowly, enjoying the simplicity of putting things where they belonged. A young woman at the front desk asked me how long I'd worked there. "Long enough to know that stories survive people," I said. And she smiled without fully understanding. One afternoon, as I was sorting a cart of returns, my phone buzzed. A text from Brian. "Can we talk?" Just us. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the edge of the cart. The old reflex, to respond quickly, to smooth things over, rose up, then settled. I typed back 2 words. "Tomorrow, noon." We met at a small diner Frank and I used to visit on Sundays after church. The booths were vinyl, cracked from years of use, and the coffee tasted the way it always had, burnt but familiar. Brian looked nervous, folding and unfolding his napkin. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what you said, about pushing." I watched him carefully. This wasn't the place for speeches. "And?" he swallowed. "I didn't mean to treat you like that." "Intent doesn't erase impact," I said gently. He nodded. "I know. I guess I panicked. Dad was always the center. When he died, it felt like everything was up for grabs. There it was. The truth, plain and small. Fear disguised as entitlement. I was scared too, I told him. But I didn't try to take anything that wasn't mine." He winced, but he didn't argue. We talked for nearly an hour, not about property or money, but about grief, how it scrambles judgment, how it can turn love into something grasping if you're not careful. He apologized again. This time, it felt less like a transaction and more like a recognition. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "I hope we can still be family." I looked at him, really looked at him. My son, older now, flawed, human. "We can," I said. "But family only works when everyone is seen." He nodded, eyes shining, and left first. At home, I opened a window despite the cold. Fresh air rushed in, sharp and clean. I brewed tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I'd overheard their whispers weeks ago. The memory no longer stung the way it had. It felt distant, like a storm that had passed, but left the ground changed. Linda remained quieter, polite, measured. I suspected she was recalibrating, learning how to interact with a version of me who no longer bent automatically. That was her work to do, not mine. I spent an afternoon reorganizing the spare room. It had been Frank's office, then a storage space for things we didn't know how to let go of. I cleared it out piece by piece, donating old equipment, shredding outdated files, keeping only what mattered. By evening, the room was open and bare, sunlight slanting across the floor. I stood there imagining possibilities. A reading chair, a small desk, maybe nothing at all. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something being negotiated behind my back. It felt like something waiting for me. That night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My hair was more gray than not, my face lined with years of giving. But my eyes looked clearer than they had in a long time. I wasn't invisible anymore, and I had no intention of ever being useful at the cost of being respected again. Spring arrived quietly, the way it does when you're not watching for it. One morning, I noticed the air through the open window felt softer, less sharp, and the maple tree in the front yard had tiny green tips where bare branches used to be. Change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just starts happening when you finally made room for it. I began walking in the mornings, a slow loop around the neighborhood with my keys tucked in my pocket and my phone fully charged. Mrs. Callahan joined me some days, her stories tumbling out between breaths. On other days, I walked alone, listening to birds and the distant hum of traffic, letting my thoughts wander without urgency. Grief still walked with me, but it no longer led. I signed up for a community center art class on a whim. Watercolors. Frank would have raised an eyebrow at that and said something about stick figures. The room smelled like paint and old linoleum, and the instructor spoke gently, as if loud voices might scare the colors away. My first attempt was terrible. My second was only slightly better. But the act of trying felt like a small rebellion against the version of myself that had stopped beginning things. One afternoon, I received an envelope from the county clerk's office. Inside was confirmation that my updated property records had been processed. My name stood alone on the page, clear and unchallenged. I placed the paper in my file and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning. Brian called that evening. He told me about his job, about a project that wasn't going well. He didn't ask about money, he didn't ask about the house. We talked the way people do when they're learning each other again. Linda sent a photo a few days later. My granddaughter, missing 2 front teeth, holding up a drawing she'd made at school. A house with a big sun above it. She says it's your house, Linda wrote, with you in it. I studied the picture for a long time. Then I wrote back, tell her I love it, and that the sun looks strong. I started cooking for myself again. Real meals, not just toast and soup. I pulled out Frank's old recipe cards, stained with grease and thyme, and tried a few. Some tasted wrong without him commenting from the other room. Others surprised me by still being good. In the evenings, I sat on the porch with a book and watched the neighborhood return to life after winter. Kids rode bikes, dogs barked. A young couple moved into the house 2 doors down, hauling boxes and arguing gently about where the couch should go. I smiled at that. Some things never change. There were still moments when the past reached out unexpectedly. A commercial jingle Frank used to hum. A receipt I found in an old coat pocket. On those days, I let myself feel it. Strength, I was learning, didn't mean denial. One Friday, I drove out to the lake cabin alone. I hadn't been there since before Frank got sick. The water was calm, reflecting the sky like a held breath. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floor greeting me like an old friend. I opened windows, swept dust, and sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The quiet there was different from the quiet at home. Wider, more forgiving. I realized then that the fear of losing things had kept me from enjoying them fully. Now, without that weight, the cabin felt like a gift again, not a bargaining chip. As the sun dipped low, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it slowly, watching light fade across the water. I thought about everything that had happened. The whispers, the documents, the meetings, the moments where I could have chosen to retreat. Instead, I'd stayed. When I drove home the next morning, tired but peaceful, I felt something settle into place. My life wasn't smaller because I'd drawn boundaries. It was larger, quieter, and finally my own. That afternoon, I pinned my first watercolor to the refrigerator. It wasn't impressive, just a wash of blue and green that vaguely suggested a shoreline. But I knew exactly what it was. It was proof that I was still allowed to begin again. By summer, the crisis no longer announced itself every morning. It had receded into the background like a scar you notice only when you brush against it. Life didn't return to what it was before Frank died. Nothing ever does. But it settled into something honest, something earned. I started getting my bills by email instead of paper. A small modernization Frank had resisted, and I now appreciated. Utilities, insurance, property taxes. I reviewed each one carefully, the way I always had, but now with a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing no one was waiting to intercept them. I set calendar reminders, added notes, and filed confirmations into folders that made sense to me alone. One afternoon, I received a notice from the county assessor. Routine, the annual valuation update. I opened it at the kitchen table, pen in hand, ready to check for errors. The numbers were reasonable. Boring, even. I smiled at that. Boring meant stable. A week later, a different letter arrived. This one was from Brian, handwritten. That alone gave me pause. I sat on the porch before opening it, listening to cicadas buzz in the trees. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. Inside, his handwriting slanted slightly to the right, uncertain but deliberate. He wrote about therapy, about realizing how much of his identity had been tied to what he might inherit instead of what he could build. He didn't excuse what he'd done. He named it. He said he was ashamed. He said he was learning to sit with that without trying to fix it by asking for forgiveness too quickly. At the end, he wrote, "I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better than the version of me you saw." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't cry. I felt something steadier than relief. Recognition. Growth, when it's real, has a quiet sound. Linda's progress was slower, but it existed. She called to ask if she could bring my granddaughter by for a visit. She asked, not assumed. She waited for my answer. They came on a Saturday afternoon. My granddaughter ran through the house like it was a museum she was allowed to touch, pointing out photos and asking questions about people she'd never met. I answered honestly, without glossing over time. "That was your Grandpa Frank," I said, showing her a picture from a camping trip years ago. "He loved this place." "Where is he now?" she asked, her voice small, but steady. I considered my words. "He's not here anymore," I said. "But the love he left is." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her exploration. Linda stood in the doorway watching us. "You seem good," she said. "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "I didn't know how to handle losing Dad." "I know," I said, "but you don't handle loss by trying to control what's left." She looked down, then back up. "I see that now." It wasn't an apology, but it was movement. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen slowly, wiping down counters, rinsing cups. The ordinary motions grounded me. Life, I was learning, was built from these small acts of care, not from grand gestures or legal threats, but from consistency. I spent more time with people who saw me as I was, not as a role. The women from the art class invited me to lunch. We talked about paint and books and aging bodies without shame. One of them, Marjorie, told me about her divorce at 72. Another talked about starting a small online business, selling handmade scarves. Their stories weren't heroic. They were real. One evening, I hosted dinner for the first time since the funeral. Nothing fancy. Roast chicken, vegetables, a pie from the bakery down the street. Brian came. Linda came. We ate at the same table where whispers had once tried to rewrite my life. The conversation was cautious at first, like stepping onto ice you're not sure will hold. But it did, slowly, naturally. At one point, Brian asked about the lake cabin, not about ownership, about memories. "Do you remember the summer we couldn't get the boat started?" he said, smiling faintly. I smiled back. "Your father refused to admit he'd forgotten to refill the gas tank." We laughed, real laughter, the kind that doesn't hide an agenda. After dinner, as they left, Linda turned back at the door. "Thank you for having us," she said, "for not shutting us out." "I didn't shut you out," I replied. "I just stopped letting myself be pushed aside." She nodded, accepting the difference. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet again, but not empty. I thought about how close I'd come to losing more than property, how easily love can become leverage if you don't guard it. I also thought about Frank, about how he'd trusted me to handle what came after him, not with anger, not with fear, but with care. I walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, not because I was afraid, but because the ritual reminded me of ownership, of presence. In the bedroom, I paused at the dresser where Frank's watch still rested. I picked it up, felt its weight, then set it back down. Some things are meant to stay where they are. As I lay down to sleep, I realized something quietly remarkable. The story that had once threatened to define my final years no longer did. It had become just one chapter. Important, yes. Painful, yes. But finished. And I was still here, awake to the life ahead of me, not as a keeper of other people's expectations, but as the author of what came next. The first anniversary of Frank's death arrived without drama. No storms, no sudden collapse, just a quiet morning and a light rain tapping against the windows like a careful knock. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where so much of my life had unfolded. Arguments, laughter, bills paid on time, trust given freely. I took out the small box where I kept the things I hadn't been ready to sort through before. Frank's watch, a receipt from our last road trip, a note he'd written me years ago on the back of a grocery list. Don't forget milk, and don't forget I love you. I didn't cry right away. I smiled first. Then I let the tears come, slow and clean, without panic. Grief no longer frightened me. It was familiar now, like an old neighbor who still stopped by but no longer stayed too long. Later that morning, I drove to the cemetery alone. I brought no flowers, just myself. I sat on the bench near his stone and told him everything. Not out loud, not dramatically, just in the quiet way married people learn to communicate without words. I told him I had kept the house. I told him I had kept myself. I told him I had learned something important far too late, but not too late to matter. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store and ran into Mrs. Callahan. She asked how I was doing, the way people do when they genuinely want to know. I'm living honestly, I said after a moment. She nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. That afternoon, my granddaughter came over with Linda. We baked cookies and burned the first batch because we talked too much. Flour dusted the counter. Laughter filled the kitchen. At one point, my granddaughter asked, "Grandma, why is your house so quiet but not sad?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because I don't let anyone take up space here unless they bring kindness with them," I said. She seemed satisfied with that. In the evening, after they left, I sat on the porch with a blanket and watched the sky darken. I thought about the woman I had been just months earlier, tired, grieving, assuming love meant endurance. I wished I could reach back and place a hand on her shoulder. I would tell her this: you are not selfish for protecting what you built. You are not cruel for saying no, and you are not weak for needing proof instead of promises. The revenge, if it could be called that, was never about taking something from my children. It was about refusing to be quietly erased, about choosing law over guilt, clarity over chaos, and self-respect over fear. What I gained wasn't victory. It was peace. These days, my life is smaller in the ways that matter least and larger in the ways that matter most. I paint, I read, I walk, I pay my bills, lock my doors, and sleep without listening for footsteps. I see my children when we all come honestly, without agendas. And when I look in the mirror now, I see a woman who finally understands this simple truth. Love does not require surrendering your voice. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you for listening, for feeling, for sitting quietly beside an old woman who learned her lesson late but learned it well. If this story moved you, you're welcome to like it or subscribe to hear more stories like mine. And before you go, I want to ask you something that matters. If you were in my place, what would you have done?